The candidates are coming, a preview of Detroit's Democratic debates, and what matters most to Michigan voters heading into 2020. We'll talk about it. Today is Sunday, July 28, 2019, and this is Flashpoint.
Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. It has been a big week in Detroit with the massive NAACP convention in town, and right behind it, another huge week with the Democratic presidential candidates facing off in 2 straight nights of debate from the Fox Theater. It is still an unwieldy mess. 10 candidates at a time, some of whom are fighting for precious pennies to keep the campaign lights on, others hoping to raise millions more than they already have so that they can suffocate the rest of the field. And this week, of course, it comes on the heels of the Robert Mueller appearance on Capitol Hill, which, while not shuffling the deck dramatically, at the very least threw a few more wild cards into the game. And Democrats do seem a little more likely to try to pursue impeachment now that Mueller testified not only that the conditions are right to charge Donald Trump after he leaves office, but also telling Congress that what little testimony the president provided in the investigation was polluted with falsehoods. We're going to talk about Mueller's appearance today. We're also going to set the stage, or perhaps I should say stages, for the debates coming up Wednesday and Tuesday. We're also going to dig into some new polling numbers on where Michiganders stand right now politically. The candidates might want to listen in. For example, most Michiganders do not want to see a Medicare for all health care system. Does that dissuade any of the candidates, or does it suggest an opening for the president, who of course pulled off the big upset win here the last time around? We're going to talk about it all today on Flashpoint. What a week it was, and that's only fair because what a week it is going to be. Let's talk about it this morning with attorney Reggie Turner, who's back with us from Clark Hill, attorney from Plunkett Cooney, and the former mayor of Royal Oak, Dennis Cowan. Columnist from the Detroit Free Press, Nancy Kaffer, is back with us, as is former Republican Congressman from Michigan, Mike Bishop. Thank you all very much for being here. Dennis, I think I want to start with you this morning. I'm not sure what it was interesting reading all the reviews about Robert Mueller's appearance, maybe looking like he was a little bit out of step to some or doddering, but I can't imagine that anybody was going to have their mind changed by anything that happened, as intractable as we are. Did anything change your mind over the past couple of days?
Well, let's not look at the reviews, let's look at the facts. Democrats and the national media promised for 2.5 years, we're going to get Trump, either on collusion or treason or something. Didn't happen. There is no collusion. Then we were promised Mueller's going to come and fix everything. He's going to come to this hearing. He's going to drop the bombshell.
Are you dancing through the end zone?
And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. This reminded me of the emergency room with Mueller as the doctor and the last gasp with the paddles to breathe life into the dead cadaver of impeachment. The Democrats don't know it. Impeachment is dead. America's moving on. What America wants, what Michigan wants is Congress get to work. Do something about the Dreamers. Do something about the American Free Trade Act, which will help and replace NAFTA, help workers and the auto industry. Let's get back to work.
Reggie, I'm not sure Jerry Nadler thinks impeachment is dead.
Well, I think my dear friend Dennis doth protest too much. In this situation, there should be a lengthy investigation. This thing will play out over the course of time. It is not over. I think the congressional investigation will go on. I think Nancy Pelosi is taking the right approach by not seeking to move toward impeachment too fast before there is sufficient evidence to ensure that that these proceedings would be worthwhile. Our country is in a period of great division. The internet is a wonderful thing, except when it isn't. And when we grew up, there was an old saying that you could have your own opinion, but you can't have your own facts.
Yeah.
In the 21st century, many people have their own facts, and they use the internet as a way to put information out that, in many cases, is just flat wrong.
Nancy, we have to be careful. We're very surrounded by attorneys. In fact, you and I may be being billed by the hour right now and don't know it. But I just keep coming. I thought going in and I thought coming out. No one's mind is ever seeming to even see the potential for change. Everybody is where they are. Doesn't matter what they hear on a weekly basis.
I think you're exactly right. I think everyone who thought that the report was bad for the president going in feels the same way, and everyone who thought that it completely vindicated him, despite the actual words that it says, is still going to feel that way. But we had to have these long hearings about what's in a report that anyone can read because no one has read it. So, I mean, there's not really a lot of, you don't really have to draw conclusions. I mean, the man wrote a lot of things about the lack of availability of information, the importance of preserving this information while memories are still fresh in case a future legal team decides to do something with it. He wrote that the president wasn't exonerated. But again, no one is going to have a different opinion on that after those hearings. I agree.
Mike, if the president is open for prosecution later, does that mean then that it should just be left alone now? Or do you let somebody who seems to be on the hook for some sort of criminality just continue to be president, I guess?
Well, that requires a lot of speculation on my part. That facts.
That's what I guess I'm trying to engender.
We don't know.
Yes, are you ready to
There's a lot of talk as to whether or not Mueller had this obligation to exonerate the president. He's got no such obligation. The president and anybody who goes through a process like this in our American jurisprudence system has the position of being innocent until proven guilty. And this process has really been turned on its head. And
but isn't that the nature of being president? I mean, it's already unusual that going in, he knew that he couldn't prosecute, he couldn't indict anyone because of a law against doing that for a president, not a law, a policy, I should say. So isn't it by definition already not the same as it would be if they were investigating you or me?
It didn't prohibit Mueller from putting facts in the report that would get to the point of charging him with a crime or elements of a crime, and really there wasn't anything in the report to get to that level. And that was the whole point of the investigation. 2 years it took to come up with really nothing that they can hang their hat on in terms of future prosecution. And I think it's a mistake for
I don't think Robert Mueller sees it that way.
Well, I don't know what Mueller sees, because he seems to have not read his own report. It didn't appear that way anyway. He was not familiar with the facts and was not familiar with what his investigation concluded.
See how everybody's doing the same points that they would have said last week if you would have asked them how the hearings were going to go?
It doesn't matter, does it?
Right.
But that's the point. Why have the hearing at all?
Well, he clearly didn't want to.
Right.
That's part of why he did not want to be there. But Dennis, as points of law, as I am speaking to an attorney, for the president to have, according to Robert Mueller, basically lied to him in what testimony he did provide, is that not problematic? As is the not reluctance, but the outright obstinance of the White House to not allow anyone to testify and answer to these subpoenas that have been coming from Congress.
Right, and that's after the White House and the Trump, the businesses and also the campaign gave 1.4 million documents. There were 500 interviews. This is not any obstruction to stop the Mueller investigation. In fact, Mueller said he was not obstructed. What this is to fight with respect to the he never complained that he was being obstructed to anybody. And he did a complete, thorough investigation. That's what that report is supposed to represent. And let's remember one other thing that's going on. The second phase of this is going to start. The Inspector General's report is supposed to come out. We have Prosecutor Durham in the Connecticut with the grand jury who is starting to investigate some of the things that happened. I said weeks ago on this show, there are many strange things that happen in this between the FBI, between the DOJ, and I think at the end of the day, we're going to get to the bottom of it.
Basic question that I've had since the start. If there was nothing untoward, why were so many lies told about who met with Russians and when? From the top down, it went on and on and on. If there was nothing untoward about it, why lie about it?
Well, the question is, you want to get to the base of criminality. And Mueller said the other day, he did not make a determination about criminality. And look at, with who he had on his staff, all the pro-Clintonistas who were on that staff, believe me, if they had found a way to get criminality into this with the obstruction, they would have done it. Let's remember, and I've talked to prosecutors about this, most prosecutors I've talked to said they were, on both sides of the aisle, said on an obstruction with the president, they'd rather have Trump's case than the prosecution's case.
But Reggie, to Dennis's point then, isn't it time to just raise the flag on this? We're in an election cycle right now. Move on.
Well, I disagree with Dennis's point with regard to the falsehoods that Mueller reported. In fact, it seems to me that lying in a federal investigation is obstruction of justice. And accordingly, I think that there is even more of a basis, essentially, to continue to investigate Mr. Trump on the basis of the fact that he did not tell the truth in the investigation.
I got to get to a quick break. We come back, we'll start setting the stage for the Democrats, all 20 of them, heading into Detroit this next week. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.
What is this? A text message from the Wayne County Treasurer's Office about my payment plan?
That's right. Our Project Text Message program allows you to enroll in our free text messaging service. All you have to do is provide your cell phone number. I'm here today with one of our customer service representatives, Karim Howe. She will explain how it works.
Our customer service team will send friendly reminders and text alert updates about your current payment plan. Everyone gets busy. We want to help you stay on track with your tax payments to avoid foreclosure. Call 313-224-5990 to enroll in our voluntary program. You will receive reminders on tax payment due dates and other important valuable information.
Join Project Text Message today by calling 313-224-5990 or email our office at textinfo@waynecounty.com. Stay in touch. Stay connected.
The 2019 Cadillacs are made for summer. It's your time to shine. GM employees and eligible family members get this low mileage lease on this 2019 Cadillac XT5 for $299 per month.
Tonight at 11.
That was one of the most shameful chapters in automotive history.
10 years ago, the unthinkable happened. Chrysler and mighty General Motors tumbled into bankruptcy.
It was such a surreal time.
A century of automaking in Detroit dying a whimper.
Now, Devin Skillion takes a look back at this record-breaking financial roller coaster and how 10 years later, the industry is surviving and thriving. Tonight on Local 4 News at 11.
All right, welcome back. Let's turn the corner now and start looking ahead. Since, as I said, I don't think any minds were changed here about that last conversation either. Let's turn the corner now and start looking ahead to the debates. It's interesting. It is great that, Nancy, that Detroit gets to host this, obviously, but I was thinking back to the first round of debates. Took place in Miami. It wasn't like there were a whole lot of Miami-centric questions involved. So I guess, does this end up, is anybody speaking or thinking about Michigan voters right now? And we're going to talk a little bit later about a poll out on where Michigan voters stand right now, or are we just sort of the venue and that'll be nice?
Well, there are a lot of issues that are going to be big in the election that really impact Michigan and have a very personal resonance in Michigan. Trade, obviously a thing. I mean, we have a large immigrant community here. Of course, same is true in Miami. So some of these issues that seem more global do have this particular resonance in our community. I would, based on the Miami performance, would be surprised if we see specific stuff come up. Though, of course, Flint could wind up coming up. There are various issues that could.
Yeah, Reggie, what do you think is coming our way this week?
Well, I agree with Nancy. I think that trade will be prominent. It's of obvious interest to the automobile industry, which is a core part of our business here in Michigan. I think that that there will be debate with regard to what should happen with regard to Trump, and accordingly, that will provide some fodder. And when I think about this conversation we've been having, picture this same scenario with Barack Obama as the president of the United States and a Republican Congress, House of Representatives investigating him. They would be so much more aggressive, in my view, with that Democratic president. Conservatives, I think, would be outraged if there was even a hint that President Obama was elected with Russian help.
Do you see that as a matter of party or a matter of race?
I think it's a combination, frankly. I think that there is a double standard here. If the Russians were believed to have have influenced the election in favor of a Democratic president, and particularly Barack Obama, I think that they would be storming the gates at the White House.
Mike, anything to that?
I think all Americans should be shocked at what the Mueller report indicated, and that was the attack on this country by the Russians. But also, we Americans have got to accept the fact that we do the same thing as Americans. Our American government is plotting and doing things in different countries all the time. We are outraged by what we know about the Russians, but Barack Obama had boots on the ground in Tel Aviv the night of the last election, trying to upend the Bibi campaign and the Netanyahu. I don't know how we as Americans can expect to change anything if we don't first lead by example. And so I think it makes sense for us to look into this issue of absolutely do whatever we can to address this issue of Russian interference. But at the same time, if we're serious about it, we have got to have the same responsibility as we expect of others.
The digital reach has kind of changed, I think, the way some of this can work, though. I mean, it is different now, isn't it, Dennis, with the ability to affect the way people think, the way people converse, with social media campaigns, internet mayhem, and on and on?
Well, I like the old days. That's when I was elected to office. It was a lot easier. But 2 points. First of all, unfortunately, President Obama did know about what was going on with Russian interference, and we still don't know today what he and the intelligence agencies he governed did and did not do, and I believe, hopefully, we'll get to the bottom of that one day. But let's talk about Democrats coming to Detroit.
Yep.
First, they come more divided than ever, and they are in a fight for the Democratic Party. This is not a feud. This is a war. And it is between the progressive wing and everybody else. I mean, Speaker Pelosi's got her hands full. And I think it's going to play out on this stage because as Mr. McAuliffe, former DNC chair, said, there's too many candidates reaching for the shiny objects. They need to answer Michiganians on where they're going to be at with helping the auto industry, with the free trade agreement, which we need desperately, with respect to this Green Deal, which would raise costs here tremendously. Where do these candidates stand? And we need to get answers to that. And by the way, one other thing, no less person than Harry Reid said, you just can't complain about Trump. You need to say what you're going to do. And the vision that Democrats have, unfortunately, up to this point, is very negative for the country.
The polling shows us that Donald Trump is not particularly popular right now in Michigan, Nancy, but I keep saying to people, well, show me who he's running against before you ask me to weigh in on what I think is going to happen in 2020. I mean, this is, there really does need to be something. Complaining is not a plan, in other words.
No, I agree with Dennis. Running as not the other guy never really works out for you. You have to articulate an affirmative vision of what you believe in and what you're going to fight for. I disagree with Dennis, though, that I'm seeing that on the debate stage. We've got a lot of voices on the debate stage, and I think that will narrow down pretty abruptly in the next few months. But you have people like Elizabeth Warren talking about plans for childcare, universal childcare, universal health care, talking about how we can use green technology to restore jobs, because a lot of manufacturing jobs, old technology jobs and things like coal aren't coming back. So we have this new whole green field, and how we can not just sort of say, oh, green stuff is good, but how we can actually be a global leader in a way that's going to create jobs. You have all these interesting plans for how we can continue to be the most important and interesting and powerful country in the world coming off that debate stage.
Mike Bishop, as we sit here today, who do you think, as you look at this field of 20, who would worry you the most as a Republican? Who would President Trump least like to face, mano a mano, or mano a woman on mano?
Just one step back on discussing this issue about who, you know, the 2016 election told us that you can run against the person and not the issues. Kamala Harris, I think, is the most, formidable for the president, and I think is on the rise and has a following, and it'll be interesting to watch to see how she responds.
Got to leave it there. Thanks, gang, for the conversation very much. When we come back, we'll talk about this poll and what some of these candidates may or may not want to consider as they take the stage this week. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.
I'm David Mann, and now you can find your fab for less with the new Art Van Signature Credit and Rewards Card. Check out this Breeze White bedroom. You get it all for just $29 a month on your Art Vantage card. Or get this color 7-piece room package with sofa, 3 tables, rug, and lamps for just $29 a month on your Art Vantage card. Come find your fab for less. The new Art Vantage Credit and Rewards Card from Art Van Furniture and Mattress will have you saying, at Art Van, you can.
Is it possible that every person in Michigan, in every zip code, can have access to the most preferred health insurance? Can a company that is always bringing leading-edge ideas
Alexa, open my Blue.
also bring the good old-fashioned roll-up-your-sleeves work we need to lift up our communities? Are we able to take 80 years of knowledge and experience and apply it every day to help everyone in Michigan? Count on it. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. Confidence comes with every card.
The region is on the rise. Project after project, building, growing, innovating. We're building the future right now. Hard work matters here. IBEW Local 58 electricians and NECA signatory contractors bring commitment, pride, expertise, and passion to every job. It's our code of excellence. One vision, one team, one mission. To build the very best Michigan for all of us. Put us to work for you. The best contractors, the best electricians, period.
Politics affects everyone.
We have to do our job. We have to work together.
When big decisions affect you,
the candidates, the issues, and the platforms.
Local 4 News and Click on Detroit are here.
The NAACP National Convention is now in full swing right here in Detroit.
Our members just don't serve, they lead.
We are in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol.
Be informed.
Standing up for what you believe in a respectful way.
From the big debate in Detroit
to the big decision in 2020.
The moments are here. We head into this week's debates among the Democratic presidential candidates against an interesting backdrop of new findings on where Michigan voters stand right now. New poll commissioned by the Detroit Regional Chamber, conducted by the Glenn Gariff Group and pollster Richard Zuba, who I hasten to mention is also our pollster here at Local 4. Let's talk about what we learned with Brad Williams from the Detroit Regional Chamber. Brad, thanks very much for coming.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
A lot of things that I think are really interesting here and have relevance for these Democratic candidates this next week. Let's start with health care. Most Michiganders don't really like the idea of moving to, especially if it was only exclusive, a Medicare for all system.
Well, and I think that's an important point to make because this was a poll taken of all voters, not just Democratic voters. So we're going to have the Democratic candidates in here on Tuesday and Wednesday, and they're going to be talking about their plans for health care. And they're trying to appeal, obviously, to Democratic voters first, but I'm hopeful that they'll have an eye towards what's going to happen next November and start thinking about what a wider pool of the electorate is going to desire, because you're not going to win the presidency unless you win Michigan.
We would certainly expect so. Another thing that was an interesting finding, though, to me, the divide between men and women. When asked whether the country is on the right track, overwhelmingly men say yes, overwhelmingly women say no.
Yeah, and I think you see that across some of the questions. There is a gender divide, and this is really, I think, an extension of what we saw in 2018, where women broke hard towards the Democrats in the midterm elections, whereas men have pretty much stayed kind of where they're at. So there definitely is a different perspective between men and women. You know, on different sides of the beds, there could be completely different opinions of the issues of the day.
Yeah. One of the areas where we expect is feeding the fact that the president is not doing particularly well in Michigan right now has a lot to do with the tariffs. Michiganders right now believe the tariffs are bad for the auto industry, bad for farmers, and bad for all of us as consumers.
Yeah, and that's welcome news for us. You know, we've long been proponents of free and fair trade.
At the Chamber,
At the Chamber, yes. And I'm looking forward to working on USMCA and getting that passed. But it seems like there is generally a consensus amongst Michigan voters that free trade is a preferable alternative to what we're seeing, which I think, if you probably look at the history of Michigan, is quite a shift as well. Michigan hasn't always been known as the kind of state where free traders are dominant.
Right. Another area that really seems to be going against where the White House has been right now, Michiganders are very concerned about climate change and its effect on the state and the Great Lakes.
Yeah, I think there is, this summer in particular has highlighted what rising water levels mean. If a lot of the folks watching today have probably spent some time up north and on the lake this summer, and you can see it. I mean, beaches that used to stretch on for 10, 15 yards are now, you know, the water's right up to the grass level. Boats that you used to have to get a step to get up to the dock, now are much higher than the dock. So I think it's not a coincidence that we've seen the summer that we've seen and the strong feelings on climate change.
Lastly, I think you found it really interesting, the divide between those who describe themselves as Fox News viewers, as opposed to that was really the only set aside. But you see
and I encourage people to go and look at the full data here. If you go to the Chamber website, DetroitChamber.com/policy poll, you can see all the data, every question we ask, because it's extensive. But if you, on question after question, there was such a divergence between those who use Fox News as their primary news source to any other news source. I mean, local news, newspaper, radio. There's divergence even between strong Republicans who are Fox News viewers and strong Republicans who get their news from other sources. It really is interesting. I don't think surprising to a lot of people who follow this stuff regularly.
Especially with immigration, you were saying earlier.
Yeah, well, I mean, immigration, we asked an open-ended question. What's the #1 issue facing the country? And it was 18% immigration. That was the top one. But if you ask Fox News viewers, that was 43% of Fox News viewers said immigration and border security was the #1 issue. Things like family separation, Fox News viewers are in a completely different place than the rest of the voters in Michigan.
Overall, I think that if you take all this data together, it does spell out a tall hill to climb for the president right now in Michigan.
Well, I think one of the key takeaways, though, is that there is consensus on many of these issues in Michigan. Healthcare might be the exception to the rule, but by and large, Michiganders have a pretty good consensus on a lot of the issues of the day.
Not a lot of 50-50 to this.
No, you know, and we all know this. Politics isn't like Twitter. It's not like cable news. It's a lot more like your family reunion, where you may have some differences on the edges, but on the most basic issues, you come together.
Fascinating week ahead, and this all informs where a lot of us are headed. So, Brett, thanks very much for the time.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. We will, of course, be watching a very big week in Detroit. The debate's coming up Tuesday and Wednesday. We'll have them covered for you here on Local 4. Meet the Press is next. Have a great week. We'll see you next time for Flashpoint.